July 9th, 1942, even in a world where cruelty had learned to wear uniforms and horror had been given ranks and medals, there existed whispers of a unit so precise, so unseen, and so devastating in its purpose that even the most hardened architects of destruction paused when its name, or rather the suggestion of its existence, floated into the air, and in a dim, smoke-heavy office thousands of miles away from the front lines, a man who believed the world itself should bend to his will listened in silence as a trembling messenger described small details that did not appear in official reports, because the strangest terrors never wore the face of chaos, they wore organization, and what unsettled him was not the body count that could not be confirmed, nor the rumours that had been filtered through fear and exaggeration, but the pattern, the strange, deliberate absence of witnesses, the villages found untouched yet lifeless, the locked doors left standing, the meal still warm on wooden tables where no hands remained to return, and it was this absence of disorder that frightened him, because disorder could be eliminated, but intention, sharpened into something quiet and deliberate, was far harder to understand, let alone control, and far across oceans, beneath skies split by unfamiliar languages and foreign thunder. A coastal town watched the tide pull away from its shore like a long, retreating breath, unaware that its name had already been written on a thin sheet of paper, inside a file stamped with characters few could read, and fewer still would ever forget. A file belonging to a division that was not known by emblem or flag, but only by whispers woven through intercepted communications, referred to simply as Unit Kuroi, the shadowed one, and as that peaceful town slipped into evening, the kind filled with simple sounds, a broom brushing dirt from wood, a child humming near a lit window, the steady clink of teacups against saucers. None of them noticed the dark line on the horizon moving without sound, vessels darker than ocean, their presence almost respectful in its silence, as though they were a part of the night itself, and when they reached land no sirens were raised, no alarm shattered the calm, because the shadowed figures that stepped onto sand did so as if stepping into a dream they had already memorized, separating without a word, disappearing between buildings, behind walls, along narrow paths, and inside these alleys and wooden homes. Stories were about to end without ever being told, not in spectacle, not in resistance, not in pleading, but in an immeasurable quiet that even the earth seemed reluctant to witness. And miles away, in a half-burned city, a young translator named Emil Hartmann, conscripted not for the strength of his body but for the fluency of his mind, sat bent over a radio console listening to scattered fragments of intercepted transmissions, his pencil frozen mid-air as a pattern emerged he had never encountered before, because these were not cries of panic, not codes of retreat or victory, but logistical confirmations so cold and deliberate they bordered on artistry. Timestamps matched perfectly, locations marked with unnatural accuracy, and a final phrase repeated at the conclusion of each signal, a sentence that made his skin go tight with something like instinct. The space has been cleaned. And as Emil stared at those words on paper that felt heavier than stone, he realized this was not the language of soldiers but of erasers, of those who believed they were not just fighting men, but deleting existence. And when his superior arrived, demanding an explanation for the sudden silence on half the coastal bands they had been monitoring, Emil could only slide the paper forward in slow disbelief, watching the colour drain from another man's face, because nothing threatens power more than something that operates beyond its understanding, and as word of Unit Kuroi travelled across continents in whispers instead of headlines, fear did not grow loud, it became disciplined, controlled, secretive, the way people behave when they do not want their own minds to believe what their logic has already accepted. And in a forgotten mountain region far from any political interest, a doctor named Hana Sato packed her small bag with hands that would not stop trembling, preparing to leave the clinic she had kept alive through shortages and bombings and grief, because she had received a visitation that morning she had hoped never to receive, a sealed envelope without sender, containing only 3 words stamped in ink dark as wet soil. Prepare the records, and she knew what it meant, because months earlier she had treated a mute boy who had wandered into her doorway barefoot and starving, his body marked not by injuries from nature but by something colder, designed, symmetrical even in its cruelty. And before disappearing again he had traced a symbol on her wooden floor with a shaking finger, a symbol that matched the one that now burned its shape into the bottom of that envelope, and in that moment she realized the rumours she had refused to acknowledge, the ones that old men spoke about only after enough drink had loosened memory, were not legends at all, but a systematic moving darkness that had just turned its awareness toward her existence. And as she slipped through mountain paths swallowed by fog, carrying nothing but ledgers containing names that should not have gone missing, She had no idea that her escape was already calculated into someone else's plan, because Unit Kuroi did not move in haste, it moved in anticipation, and somewhere on a table in a structure no map ever recorded, a small wooden token was placed onto a grid beside her name. Not as a threat, not as vengeance, but as acknowledgement that her existence was an equation now balanced, and throughout that same night, in an isolated estate far removed from gunfire but not from power, a man who believed fear was a tool like any other found himself pacing slowly before a tall window, his breath heavier than usual, the briefing still echoing through his thoughts, as his closest officer repeated again what he had already refused to accept, that there were regions no longer responding, that communications ceased without trace, that entire corridors were becoming blind not because of open rebellion, but because something else, something independent, something unaligned, had begun to remove life with absolute discretion, and as thunder rolled outside and shadows stretched long across polished floors, the only unguarded words that left his mouth that night were whispered not in rage, not in command, but in rare, unsettled realization. These are not men at war, these are men beyond it. And in that uneasy moment, when even power clenched its fist out of uncertainty, the true story of Unit Kuroi was only just beginning, because what history rarely teaches is that the most terrifying forces are not those driven by ideology, but those driven by the belief that they exist outside of it entirely. August 1st, 1942. The most unsettling discoveries are never made on battlefields. They are found in filing cabinets, behind ink-stained hands and careful signatures, and it was inside a small, nearly forgotten administrative building that should have been reduced to rubble months earlier that the first solid traces of Unit Kuroi were uncovered, not in the form of maps or photographs, but within the margins of ledger books where someone had written notes too important to include in official channels, names struck through, not in anger but in neat clinical lines, dates that matched disappearances that had never been questioned closely enough, and alongside each crossed-out entry, a single, repeating character that did not translate into any familiar military code, a character that simply implied removal rather than death, as though whoever had written it believed that existence itself could be edited if you traced the correct symbol in the correct place, and the man who found this ledger was not a general or an officer trained to analyze threats, but a simple archivist named Thomas Varga, one of the few men who still believed numbers told the full truth of the world, and as his fingers trembled while turning each delicate page, he began to understand that he was not holding a record of casualties, nor enemies, nor operations, but a list of places that had been intentionally cleaned away, communities deemed unnecessary for reasons never spoken aloud, people assigned to silence rather than imprisonment. And what chilled him most was not the scale of it, but the consistency, because it followed nothing as chaotic or emotional as war. It followed geometry, as if entire families had been reduced to mere points on a hidden design only one hand could see. And when Varga reported what he had found, his superiors laughed it away as the ramblings of an overworked clerk, because men in command prefer simple dangers, visible dangers, not the idea of something that erases from a distance, leaving nothing to shoot, no camps to storm, no flag to tear down. And while his superiors dismissed it, others began to take notice quietly, privately, in ways that could not be documented without risk. And one of those was a retired intelligence officer named Klaus Ritter, a man who had outlived 2 regimes and learned how to hide his thoughts behind patient silence. And when the ledger was passed into his wrinkled hands in a room that smelled of dust and old ink, he did not scoff or delay. He simply nodded once, as if the information confirmed something he'd been fearing for years, and he spoke at last of a concept buried deep beneath classified theories, something called the Veiled Division, a rumoured program formed at the very beginning of the war by minds who believed that to truly control a world, you had to understand not how to conquer it, but how to remove parts of it without leaving scars, and the original thought had been shared between a few powerful nations. But as pride and paranoia grew, each one supposedly split off, creating their own version in secret, each more extreme than the last, and Unit Kuroi, he believed, was not a normal military assignment, but an experiment born of obsession, formed from soldiers who had been stripped of personal ties, trained not to hate, not to love, not even to fear, but to calculate human presence as removable matter, a philosophy so inhuman it frightened even the most hardened strategists when they began to comprehend its implications, and Dr. Hana Sato, still travelling through uneven terrain, with records pressed against her chest like a second fragile heart, felt that philosophy in the very air around her, in how birds scattered too early, in how villages stood silent even when no bombs had touched them, because there is a kind of silence that does not feel empty but watched, as if the space itself is evaluating your right to inhabit it, and when she arrived at a mountain monastery abandoned except for an old monk who had refused to leave, she placed her bag down as if surrendering her burden and asked the only question she had left in her soul, whether names could still protect lives, and the monk, his face etched with time that war could not claim, opened her notebook and studied the list of those who had vanished, and rather than speaking words of comfort or reassurance, he simply said that writing names down is the final rebellion against those who wish to erase them, because the world may forget flesh, but it will always remember ink, and far from that quiet act of resistance, Emil Hartmann sat once again before the radio static, tracing patterns that no longer formed coincidences but instead systems, seeing how coastlines, trade paths, and culturally significant regions were being methodically stripped of voices. And he understood in that moment that Unit Kuroi was not just eliminating random points, but pieces of a story, pages being torn from a book so that the ending could be rewritten by someone else entirely. And the gravest realization of all came when he saw where their pattern pointed next. A convergence point so symbolically important that its removal would rip a hole in memory itself. And he dared to whisper its name only once to the shadow of the room before him. A city known not for weapons or armies, but for knowledge, art, and shared human memory. And at that same hour, men in dark coats stood in a foreign alley, beneath a sign written in fading letters, their faces carved with discipline so deep it no longer resembled human expression. And one of them unrolled a small piece of paper stamped with the same dark symbol that had found its way to Hanna's door. And as the others waited in absolute stillness, he spoke a sentence not as orders, not as mission briefing, but as a conclusion already accepted by all of them. Tonight, history becomes clutter. And with that simple declaration, they stepped forward as if stepping between moments, disappearing into a world that had no idea it was about to be quietly changed. While somewhere far removed from all these events, immersed in luxury and guarded illusions, a man who considered himself the centre of history stared at yet another report filled with gaps instead of victory, and for the first time in his life he did not feel anger rise in him, nor hunger for domination. He felt something far colder and far heavier settle into his bones. The realization that there existed a kind of control that did not belong to him and never had, and in that recognition, a sentence was formulated behind his teeth that he would never speak publicly, yet would forever echo privately. If this continues, they will not need armies, they will only need time. And with that unspoken acceptance, the world moved one step closer toward an invisible line, drawn not across land, but across the fragile idea of what it meant to exist at all. September 12th, 1942. The most dangerous moment in any hidden operation is not when it is discovered by enemies, but when it begins to be questioned from within. And it was on this quiet, windless night that the first crack appeared inside Unit Kuroi itself, not as rebellion, not as chaos, but as something far more fragile and therefore more powerful. Hesitation, a pause measured not in seconds but in conscience, because within a low-lit facility burrowed into the side of a mountain that did not appear on any official map, a man named Lieutenant Haru Takeda stood alone in a narrow corridor, listening to the faint echo of his own breathing, something he had been trained to ignore years ago. And he realized that for the first time since being assigned to the unit, the silence around him felt different. Not empty, but questioning, as though the walls themselves were asking whether they should continue to exist. And Takeda had once been told that emotion was a weakness, that memory was a threat, that empathy was a flaw to be carved out of a soldier like rot from wood. Yet there he stood, watching technicians and officers pass by with faces stripped of humanity, and all he could see were shadows pretending to be men, and the truth that had been whispering beneath his thoughts for months no longer hid itself. This was not war. This was erasure, not against enemies, but against anything deemed too inconvenient to remain part of the world being quietly redesigned, and that truth first reached him days earlier, when he had been asked to escort a convoy, scheduled not for capture or transport, but for removal, and among the silent passengers of that transport had been a small girl clutching a soft torn book, her eyes meeting his through the dimness of the vehicle's interior, and she had not cried, had not moved, had only watched him with a look so calm and unafraid that it shattered something deep beneath the discipline hammered into him, because in that look he recognized the same quiet strength he had once seen in his own younger sister, long before the world had taken them in different directions, and when the operation had ended and he had stepped back into outside air, he had found his hands shaking against his will, and from that moment forward, the Junta's perfect structure had begun to crumble inside his mind, and he noticed others, small signs of fracture, a man who paused too long before following orders, another who had begun whispering prayers before sleeping, a third who cleaned his boots not for inspection, but as if scrubbing away invisible stains, and Takeda understood that though Unit Kuroi was designed to think as one mind, it was still haunted by many hearts, and hearts, no matter how quietly they suffer, eventually begin to speak, and in a separate hidden location, Dr. Hana Sato unfolded her pages one final time before a small gathering of refugees, teachers, artists, and displaced souls whom she had gathered under the protection of nothing more than shared silence, and she read aloud every name she had recorded, letting each syllable breathe into the open night as if calling those people back into existence. And Emil Hartmann, now travelling under false identity, mapping the invisible paths of Kuroi's movement, stood among them listening not as a soldier or translator, but as a witness to resistance that did not require weapons, because every spoken name weakened the unit's purpose in a way violence never could. And word of this strange gathering, this invisible uprising of memory, reached Takeda through channels not meant for official communication, and when he overheard that names were being restored somewhere in the mountains, his chest tightened with a realization that felt like both terror and relief, because if what they were doing could be undone by a simple voice refusing silence, then perhaps the unit, for all its precision, had already misunderstood the very world it sought to alter, and it was only a matter of time before action had to be taken, not under command, but under conscience. And that same night, an order came down the corridor in clipped, unemotional tones, stating that a final convergence point had been selected for the next phase of cleaning, and the name of the city was one the world adored, rich with libraries, culture, and human history, a place whose essence rested not just in its streets, but in memory itself. And as Takeda held the document in his hands, seeing the symbol stamped upon it, he felt history itself balancing on a single decision, because to follow the order would mean helping erase a soul from the planet as memory, but to disobey it would mean the death of everything he had ever been trained to be. And it was then, in that narrow, dim passage where no eyes watched and no guns were raised, that Lieutenant Haru Takeda made the most violent choice of all he refused in silence, folding the paper neatly, slipping it into his coat, and walking not toward the command chamber, but toward the tunnels that led outside, and one by one, without a word exchanged, others followed his path as if an invisible thread had bound them together long before that moment. And by the time alarm signals finally echoed through the mountain walls, Unit Kuroi no longer moved as a single mind. It had fractured into individuals again, and individuality in any system built upon erasure is the beginning of its end. And when those who remained loyal gave chase, they found only darkness, empty corridors, and the faint echo of footsteps leading back not to freedom, but to humanity, and somewhere beyond the final ridge of that mountain, beneath a sky scattered with indifferent stars, Takeda stepped into open air no longer wearing the shadow of a unit but the burden of a choice, knowing that even if the world never learned his name, it might someday remember the city that was not erased because of it, and in the very heart of power, within silent gilded rooms that once dictated the shape of the future, reports arrived describing internal collapse, desertion, refusal, and something even more alarming. That Kuroi had begun to undo itself, and a man who had once believed that fear was the highest form of authority closed his eyes and understood at last that there are forces in this world no nation can command, no flag can tame, no ideology can fully own, because the most dangerous thought is not rebellion, but remembrance. And with each name spoken aloud in the darkness, each record preserved, each conscience rediscovered, the shadow that had once moved so confidently across the world began, slowly and inevitably, to recede, knowing that it had finally met the only enemy it could never erase: a human being who chooses to remember October 30th, 1942. The end of something that was never meant to exist rarely arrives in the form of victory. It arrives in exhaustion, in silence, in the slow realization that a shadow can only survive as long as no one chooses to name it. And on this cold, breathless morning, as the world continued its loud, clashing war, unaware of the quieter battle that had just reached its turning point, the last remnants of Unit Kuroi did not march into combat or retreat in glory. They simply stopped moving altogether, stranded between obedience and awareness, their command network fractured, their channels broken into static, their once perfect pattern now unravelling like thread pulled from old cloth, and within the mountain structure that had served as its heart, lights flickered and died one by one, as if even the electricity had lost faith in its purpose, and men who had long forgotten how to think as individuals began, slowly and painfully, to feel again, to remember voices, faces, pieces of themselves that had been stripped away in the name of efficiency, and for many of them that return to awareness was more terrifying than any battlefield had ever been, because it forced them to confront not an enemy before them, but the hollow space left behind by what they had become. and outside, along narrow paths dusted with fog, Lieutenant Haru Takeda stood watching dawn break over a land he no longer recognized, yet felt more connected to than ever before, knowing that a choice made in one quiet corridor had altered an entire invisible war, and while the world would never carve his name into monuments or sing of his defiance, the very fact that a city still stood, that children still passed through streets that had been marked only weeks before for erasure, was proof enough that a single human decision still had the power to outweigh an entire system designed to eliminate it. And miles away in the abandoned monastery, Dr. Hana Sato added the final pages to her ever-growing collection of names. But this time she did not write in sorrow alone. She wrote in confirmation, in quiet defiance, because every name she had recorded had now become a witness not only to loss, but to resistance, and beside her stood Emil Hartmann, no longer staring at waves of coded silence, but at open air and open sky, realizing that the most powerful transmissions are never sent through machines, but through memory carried from one heart to another. And together they buried the final ledger not in the ground, but within the walls of the monastery, sealed in stone, preserved not for governments or generals, but for a future that might one day dare to look honestly at its past. And while world leaders continued to issue commands, draw borders, shift lines on maps as if existence itself were made of paper, the veiled division that had once terrified even the most confident of their ranks was gradually removed from references, classified, obscured, its architects dissolving their own evidence out of fear that history might one day judge them by the lives they had tried to subtract. And across distant lands, stories began to circulate not of a brutal unknown force, but of towns that had inexplicably survived, of villages that had once been marked for disappearance, but instead felt unnaturally protected, and some said it was luck, others coincidence, but a few old souls whispered of a hidden fracture within darkness itself, where men once trained to erase chose instead to stop. And when a tired world finally signed papers that said the war was over, there was no mention on those documents of Unit Kuroi, no official recognition of its fall, because the world prefers neat endings and this one was anything but. And yet, years later, a child walking through a quiet library in a restored city brushed his fingers against the spine of an old nondescript book that had no title on its cover, and inside, pressed between yellowed pages, he found a faded piece of paper with a list of names written in careful, loving strokes, and at the bottom, handwritten in a different script, were 7 simple words: "If you can read this, you remain." And that child did not know then why the words made his chest ache, why the air felt heavier around him, why the silence between the shelves felt respectful. But he instinctively understood that this was not a message meant to frighten, but to remind. Because the most important stories are the ones that almost disappeared, and though Unit Kuroi would never appear in textbooks or museums, its true legacy was written not in fear, not in violence, not in power, but in the quiet continuation of life itself, in voices that still spoke, in streets that still echoed with footsteps, in memories that, despite everything that had tried to erase them, stubbornly, beautifully refused to die. And somewhere, perhaps only in imagination, perhaps in the deep unseen corners of the world, where stories linger long after their tellers are gone, the shadows that once believed themselves beyond judgment faded into nothing. Not destroyed, not conquered, but simply made unnecessary by something far more enduring than control humanity, refusal to forget itself.